Hello, everyone. My name is Tyrone Nance. During this presentation, I'll be discussing Lab 4, our second hack, Part 1. The objectives I'll cover will be, I'll discuss the hypothesis for Chi-Optics 2 virtual machine. I'll discuss vulnerability analysis and mapping. I'll discuss tools and techniques that I use to identify vulnerabilities. I'll share techniques that I use to trace the vulnerability to root cause. I'll discuss attack vector choices. And finally, I'll discuss standard associated with vulnerability disclosure. Hypothesis for Chi-Optics 2 virtual machine. First, let me just discuss the hypothesis flaw methodology, which essentially is where you identify a target source, you do some research on potentially what vulnerabilities may be associated with it, then you proceed to test the target source to confirm that there are vulnerabilities on it, and then subsequent to that, you would rank the vulnerabilities and put together a plan for remediation. So let's begin. So what I began with was, initially, I went onto my network and scanned the network to identify the IP address for the Chi-Optics 2 box. So you see I ran the nmap command across the network /24. I confirmed that the IP address of Chi-Optics 2 is 192.168.56.115. I also knew from some research that the Chi-Optics 2 machine is known to have lots of vulnerabilities. And so what I did was to conduct a more intrusive scan using the nmap switch lowercase p switch switch capital A. And with this, I was able to enumerate the box and identify some of the ports and vulnerable services that are around. For example, port 22, you see OpenSSH, you see version 3.9, that could be vulnerable. You see port 80, you have Apache HTTP version 2.0.52, that could be a vulnerability. Port 443, you see Apache running version 2.0.52, that potentially could be vulnerable as well. And then finally on this screen, port 631 is running CUPS 1.1. But I went one step further, rather than just rely on the nmap. I also ran Nico scanner, and it came back, again, you see right here, I ran Nico, H was the host, pointing to the Chi-Optics box, which is a 113 last octet. And you'll see that on this box, it confirmed the same vulnerability we saw on the nmap command, but it also introduced a couple of different ones. It introduced the X-powered by header PHP 4.3.9. It introduced the anti-clicking, jacking, X-frame. It also identified a cross-scripting potential vulnerability as well. So I've now proceeded with scanning and confirming that there are some vulnerabilities. So let's move on to the next step. So now that I've confirmed there's some vulnerabilities, the next thing I did was I conducted an analysis on 10 of the vulnerabilities that I identified between the two scanning techniques, the nmap and using Nico. But for the sake of brevity, on this screen, I'm only going to discuss 6 of the vulnerabilities. So I'm presenting here 3 under the knowledge service category. For the 443, Apache around version 2.0.52, Linux vulnerability around versioning as well, and CUPS 1.1. And under the authentication category, I confirmed there's a vulnerability associated with port 306, which is MySQL. There's the X-powered header that we saw in the Nico scan, and then we have the RPC vulnerability as well. But for the sake of the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the Apache 443 Apache vulnerability. That's why I've bolded this. So let's move on. So tools and techniques I used. First thing I did was I searched the string Apache HTTPD 2.0.52 exploit. And when I browsed that, lo and behold, it came up with a link that said vulnerabilities and exploits. And one of the interesting things that I noticed at this link was that it identified a CVE 2005-2088. So I clicked on that link. After going to that link and get more details on the CVE, it provided some very specific or more elaboration from a vulnerability summary standpoint. And what I learned from this was that But this vulnerability is essentially, again, it's specific to a certain version up to 2.0.55, which our version does fall under that, which makes us vulnerable. And what it does is that whenever this version is used on a server that's acting as a HTTP proxy, that's when it allows a user to essentially bypass the application firewalls and conduct cross-script attacks. That's what XSX stands for. And so that's the specific implication. So with regard to just thinking about a root cause, well, the root cause for most of this vulnerability is that the version is outdated and needs to be upgraded beyond 2.0.55. So if we were to upgrade it beyond that, we would essentially remediate this vulnerability. So in that, as I mentioned from the summary in the previous slide, there are a couple of attack vectors. Because it has the potential to bypass firewalls, it creates an opportunity for a distributed denial of service attack. Because once you can bypass the firewall, it gives you the ability to, at will, just kind of hit against resources and essentially cause damage to the organization resources and affect operations. Another thing being able to bypass firewalls does is it creates an opportunity to install malware that could also be used to damage or disrupt operations for an organization. So two attack vectors are denial of service, as well as malware, ability to deploy malware. And so let's talk about standards associated with vulnerability disclosure. Well, I researched 3 organizations. Let's start with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And essentially, they encourage the reporting of vulnerabilities anonymously, which is good for people so they don't have to be tethered to it. And that should encourage people to come forward. It also encourages any new vulnerabilities that you discover, you should report those. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency says when you report, you should describe the location of the vulnerability and the potential of impact of the exploitation. And you should also offer a detailed description of the steps that's needed to reproduce the vulnerability. Department of Homeland Security encourages reporting anything that's discovered on the internet, that's internet accessible. And that makes sense because you don't really want to leave anything out there that potentially could impact a whole lot of resources, because so many resources around on the internet. And then final bullet, Department of Homeland Security reference to see something, say something. And I think this falls more under the ethics. It's great that the Department of Homeland Security mentions it, but I think it's just one of those things where you have to look out for each other. If you know something's going on, you should speak up and communicate it. Again, there are numerous ways and you can be anonymous about it, so there's no reason not to. Thank you.